The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everybody. This is Eric Johnson with Aurora WDC, here for our latest Advanced Marketing and Strategy webinar. Today we have with us Bruce Rosenstein, who is the author of the new book, Create Your Future, the Peter Drucker Way. I had the opportunity to meet Bruce, I think it was it the year before last in Chicago at the Special Libraries Association meeting in Chicago. And we just hit it off. I'm a huge fan of Peter Drucker, and Bruce is an expert on the man and his career and life and influence on modern management. I guess, inventing modern management and all. So very much looking forward to Bruce's remarks today regarding his insights in his new book. He wrote another book that he may refer to here as well on the life of Peter Drucker and some of his work in business as well. We are recording this, just so everybody knows. We'll record this and send around a YouTube link probably later this afternoon with a follow-up email to you all, along with a link to slides, probably in PDF format for you to share. Feel free to share those with colleagues and spread the word. We will have a January webinar also. The topic is pending. I've got a couple of people who are interested in doing that. And need to nail down a date for it. So if you have a topic that you think you would like to present to this group, please reach out to me after the webinar, and would be delighted to try and help design a webinar just like this one that we did with Bruce. Alan Michaels, you're also online here. Alan, did you have any opening remarks you wanted to say to the group?
I just wanted to say thank you, Eric, and thank you, Bruce, and thank you, everybody, for being part of the LinkedIn group. Thanks, Eric.
Wonderful. Thanks, Alan. Bruce, I guess with no further delay, let's go ahead and have you tell us how to create your future the Peter Drucker way.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Eric, and thanks also to you, Alan, and thanks to everybody who's in on the webinar today. I really appreciate your being here. And my goal is for you to learn as much as possible within this 1 hour that we have about not only Drucker, but about how his work can further your future, both in a personal sense, in an organizational sense, and a professional sense. So I feel that you don't necessarily need to have any prior knowledge of Drucker. If you do, that's fine. I think you'll still learn quite a bit. But what we're really talking about here are his concepts and his way of delineating the future, which was just such a important part of his work, and it's something that really fascinated me. And as Eric said, this is my second Drucker-related book. The first one came out in 2009. It was called Living in More Than One World, How Peter Drucker's Wisdom Can Inspire and Transform Your Life. And in that book, what I did was to put a framework around Drucker's work on the individual as opposed to Drucker and the organization. And I interviewed Drucker before he died. He was in 2005, he died at the age of 95. So I put a framework around his work on the individual. For this book, what I've done is put a framework around his work on the future. And that had not been done by anyone else, including Drucker. Drucker himself never organized all his work on the future, and I felt that I needed to be the one to do it. So first, what I wanted to do is just give you a real quick Peter Drucker 101. As you can see on the screen, Drucker was born in 1909. He died in 2005. It was actually 8 days before his 96th birthday. And he has three main parts to his professional career. The first was as a consultant, and he did this for many years, and he did two parts of consulting. One was for major corporations. I just listed a couple here, General Electric and Procter & Gamble, but there were many, many more all over the world. And he also did nonprofits, such as the Girl Scouts of the USA, American Red Cross, Salvation Army, many, many more. And he really learned a lot in what he, in terms of his discussions with his consulting partners. And I think this is one way that he himself helped create his own future, was because he would be hearing about and contributing to the future plans of a number of different, really widely varying organizations. So that was one part. Another part was as an author of more than 40 books, millions and millions of copies worldwide. If you go into bookstores, you'll see probably several of his books at least. And of course, as far as I know, just about all of his books are still available and still in print. And I should say, besides being an author, he wrote many, many articles, and he wrote for top-notch publications. He did column for 20 years for the Wall Street Journal. He wrote for Forbes, Fortune, The Atlantic, Harvard Business Review, a number of different publications. So all this going on while he's writing these books, more than 40 books. And by the way, those were translated into something like 35 or 36 languages around the world. And then the third part was that he was a longtime professor. The Drucker School, wouldn't it be great to teach at a school named after you? The Drucker School, it's the full title of it now is the Peter F. Drucker and Masatoshi Ito Graduate School of Management at Claremont Graduate University, which is in Southern California. Before that, he taught at NYU, and he taught at a couple of other schools before that. But he came out to California in 1971 and taught at the Drucker School pretty much until the time of his death in 2005. So those were the three major parts of his career. But again, this idea of creating the future that was just so important. It was a thread that ran through his books and articles over many years. And again, because he didn't do one book on the future, I felt that it was fertile ground for me to work in and to really go through his material. So I went through the interview material I had with him. I went through his books. I went through material in the Drucker archives out in California to find about, what are the most important things about Drucker's work for the future. Now, one thing that this is really, really key to how he said that you should handle yourself both personally and professionally when you were talking about priority setting is that you focus on the future, not the past. And that's, I believe, really tough for lots of people. It's not easy to do because the past is important. There's no doubt about that. But the future is where we're going, both personally and professionally and organizationally. So, how are we going to get there? So, in going through Drucker's work, I came up with 10 elements of his work on the future. Now, it's important to say here, these are all present within Drucker's work and his teaching and his writing, but I'm the one who decided that they really belonged within these 10 elements. And these are things I delineate further in the book, but I'm laying them out here for you on this slide. And this idea of the mindset, the first one, and then not a particular order here because they're sort of holistic and they work together, but that the best way to approach the future is that you keep it in mind as you go about your daily life and work, that the future really is a mindset. It was really a fundamental thing about how Drucker worked, that it was just part of his being, that the future is so important that you need to keep it in mind. So that's the first thing, is that the future is a mindset. The second is uncertainty. And let's face it, the future is essentially unknown. It's unknowable. It's uncertain. It's unpredictable. Nobody really likes those sorts of things. So we have to work around that. We have to work with it. And you can't assume that the future will be similar to today. It could be, but it's very possible that it won't be. And the third part, because of all that, is the idea of creation, that despite and because of this unpredictability, the future must be built and created. And again, this was a real bedrock, central, deep insight of Peter Drucker's. And I think that it's just so important that we just have to just sit there here and think about that for a moment, that it really is up to us to create our futures, both in a personal sense, professional sense, and an organizational sense. Yes, lots of other factors will be involved, but it's something that we really need to work towards. Now, when I say here about inevitability, I'm talking about a phrase that he used starting around the late 50s and early 60s, and he kept using it for the rest of his career, which was this wonderful phrase called the future that has already happened. So what is it? What are the events? What are the trends that basically are, in some sense, history? They've already happened, but there's inevitable coming of effects of those events that have already taken place, but the effects have not yet hit. So what can you learn about that, and how can you use that to your to your advantage. We'll talk about that a little bit more as we go on in the webinar. The next is the idea of the present moment. The future is created within the present moment. So people who feel that by focusing on the future that you're somehow just putting things off is not the case. The future unfolds based on and really because of our thoughts, our actions, our choices, our commitments, and the decisions, all these things that you're doing right now. This is where this is for all of us listening today, myself, all of us participating. We are creating our futures by what we do today. And the next is another thing that I think a lot of us are not always crazy about, which is the idea of change. But Drucker said that people and organizations should accept this as normal, as ongoing, that we should be organized for change. And he also said that it should be driven by change leaders and change agents. In fact, he said change agent really wasn't good enough, and that's, of course, pretty hard to begin with, but that we should be change leaders as well. Now, the next point is about reflection, and that the observations you make about your potential futures should include the implications for your personal life and for your work. So Drucker felt that a lot of times people did reflect on what was going on, what could be going on for the future, but they didn't go to that next step and say, what does this really mean for me? What does it mean for me personally? What does it mean for me within the workplace? What does it mean for my organization? And I think we can also broaden that out to what does that mean for my profession? I would imagine that a number of people who are participating in the webinar today are in professions that maybe are under some threat, and the future is uncertain. So what can we do to further that and to make that situation somehow better and improved? Now the next point is, I call it remove, improve. That's not the language that Drucker used. Drucker used this construct over many years called systematic abandonment. He also called it planned abandonment. That was the remove part of it. The improve part of it was this concept, which my understanding, the word is Japanese, but the concept is American, of Kaizen, which is, as you know, or as you probably know, this idea of steady incremental improvement. So with systematic abandonment, what you're doing is you're asking yourself, if you weren't already doing a particular activity, process, if you weren't already making a particular product, would you start doing it now? Would it seem like a good idea? And if it didn't, what would you do about it? Is there a way you could scale it back or just stop doing it? Then with what's left, you go about Kaizen, about improving it, and that maybe over a period of time this would lead to genuine innovation. Of course, that leads to this next point on your slide, which is innovation and entrepreneurship. And Drucker literally wrote the book on this, just a great classic book from 1985 called Innovation and Entrepreneurship. It's still referenced all the time. It still sells. In that book, and I go into a little bit of detail about it within my book, but certainly within Drucker's book, he really talks about just what we mean when we're talking about these topics of innovation and entrepreneurship. Innovations in service, products, processes. These are the kind of things that are major drivers of creating the future for our organizations and for just the economy in general. The entrepreneurs certainly create new enterprises of value, and this means something for society and for the economy, not just nationally, but ideally globally. And the last point is about risk, and this is just something else. This is, I would say, similar to change and to uncertainty. This is something that is not always easy to get our arms around, and we don't always like. But he did say that continual change means challenges from disruptive technologies, disruptive other businesses, and turbulence. He had a great book from 1980 called managing in turbulent times. So think about that. If 1980 was turbulent, what it's like now at the end of 2013. Risk is ever present, but the whole idea is working with risk and maybe minimizing risk, because the idea of doing nothing can also be dangerous. So those are the 10 elements of the future. And right now in the slide you see up here, this is from a Harvard Business Review Press book called Peter Drucker on the Profession of Management. It came out in 1998. And this is this whole idea, and you'll have this slide, so I won't read the whole thing, but this is what gets into the meat of this idea of the future that's already happened. And he wrote an article, by the way, in not 1998, but 1997, before this book came out. He wrote an article for the 75th anniversary edition of the Harvard Business Review called "The Future That Has Already Happened," and you can probably find that online. So it's one thing to say, okay, well, there's this concept of the future that's already happened, but how can we determine it? So I have 2 parts here for you. These are my suggestions, and I think you'll come up with others as well. The first part is human intelligence, learning about what the future may hold through other people. So some suggestions that I'm making are that you form future-oriented groups, and this could be book groups. It could be adapting an existing book group or creating another book group, and there's certainly enough books to read out there that would have some impact on the future. So that would be one, that you meet regularly in those types of groups. Another thing would be what you would learn within your workplace, with bringing in speakers for brown bag events or similar events, people who would have something to say about this topic, about where the world might be heading and what your place is in that. The third is this idea of journal clubs, and this was a concept that until a few years ago I was not familiar with, but I did learn about it because I was the guest speaker at a journal club at Catholic University of America, where I teach as an adjunct professor in the Department of Library and Information Science. But I spoke in the main library at Catholic, and they have a journal club, and I was the guest speaker after my first book came out. And the whole idea here is that this happens especially in the medical and scientific fields, that a group meets for a journal article, and they really go very in-depth into that journal article within, let's say, a 1-hour time period. So you could adapt that to the future. Pick an article from a journal or a magazine and do that on a regular basis and meet probably within your workplace, but it doesn't have to be your workplace. It could be, let's say, for a professional association, a civic association, something like that, where you could benefit from that kind of work. Now, the second part is something that I'm sure lots of people who are in on this webinar are involved in professionally, the idea of searching for information to find the future that's already happened. First would be through databases, through the free databases that you would just get on the open web, and then the fee-based databases, which possibly, depending on where you work, are available within your workplace. Many of us now have good public libraries who provide, as just having your library card, provide access to these databases that otherwise would be fee-based. So those are 2 parts of it. Of course, the web searching really goes along with that, and of course, some web searching will be free, most of it, but some of it will be fee-based as well. Monitoring of newspapers, magazines, and journals. That, of course, is a combination of print and online. Learning about demographic information, which Drucker, if you read that article from the Harvard Business Review, where he talks about the importance of demographics and getting demographic information. And let's face it, for most of the time that he was working, it was harder to find demographic information. Of course, now it's relatively easy. Government reports and statistics, again, these are the sorts of things that are available to us pretty readily online. And we'll talk a little bit later about applying competitive intelligence techniques. Another thing in terms of the future, how are we going to learn about what might impact the future, who's really studying the future, would be things like, and this I also put here because to me it's inspirational. So these are future-oriented prizes, honors, and awards, and you can see the types of things that I've listed in the book. I have a resource section with the URL for all of these, but you read the who wins, the individuals and organizations who win these awards on a yearly basis, and it's really quite inspirational to read who wins these awards. Go through some more awards here on the second screen. Of course, you see the TED Prize, the Nobel Prizes. Of course, Drucker, by the way, in one of his books, had a great quote saying that every year he read the acceptance speeches of Nobel Prize winners. And when you think about that, in those days, that was written in 1969, it was a lot harder to get that sort of information. Now, of course, that's very, very readily available information. And of course, another one of my really favorite awards that are given out, they're actually fellowships. The colloquial term is the Genius Grants. They're not really called that. They're called the MacArthur Fellowships, Fellows Program, given out every October around the time of the Nobel Prizes. MacArthur Foundation. Those are really forward-focused, future-focused awards. $625,000 to, I think it's 24 or so individuals. But it's really meant to not just reward the work they've done in a variety of fields, but it's also meant to in essence bankroll part of their future work. And now again, I list here some, and I list more in the book, various organizations and think tanks that a big part of what they do is focus on the future. So again, going to the websites of these organizations, here's part 2. And what can you learn from them about the future? 2, they're particularly just focused, or the whole organization is focused on the future. The IFTF, Institute for the Future, and the World Future Society. And I love their slogan, which is tomorrow is built today. So Drucker, I believe, when we're talking about the organization now, Drucker could really be of the tough love school of advice to managers. And I just love this quote. This is from a book that came out in 1996 called The Executive in Action. The seemingly most successful business of today is a sham and a failure if it does not create its own and different tomorrow. It must innovate and recreate its products or services, but equally the enterprise itself. That's really strong medicine, and I think that it really just goes to show you that, and we've seen this play out recently with, especially with smartphone companies, where companies that were really riding high then ended up having significant problems. So we've seen this play out over a number of years. What are some things that we can do in terms of that are more organizationally focused than individually focused? And I talk about both in the book, but we want to do in this section on what's organizational. So I have some quotes here. Eric Johnson, the co-presenter today. I won't read the whole quote, but this whole idea of just if you're going to use competitive intelligence, if you're going to try to do that, what are some of the delineating factors, and how can it be future oriented? Also, Craig Fleischer from the same organization, and Eric mentioned that we all connected at the SLA conference in Chicago in 2012, and I was just fascinated to learn more about what these folks did in terms of their work, their organization, and I asked them to contribute quotes to the book, and I'm really happy that they did that. And if you look at Eric's quote here, competitive intelligence is by design and tasking a process that helps executives and organizations to envision a more desirable future. I mean, that's where we want to go, but it's really difficult how to get there, so that's why we kind of need all these techniques. Now, a third person I met during that SLA was Chris Hote from Digimind USA. I believe he's the CEO of Digimind USA. Again, this is another quote from the book, and you'll see more from all these people within the book. But again, this whole idea of competitive intelligence, and I'm sure a number of you who are in on this webinar actually work in this field, and you really have a lot of ideas about how you do it and what you use it for. But I think to a broader audience, and maybe who's not familiar with it, that hopefully these quotes from Craig and Eric and Chris can help people just decide, is this a good way for us to go as one key to the puzzle for furthering our organization. In a similar sense, this whole idea of appreciative inquiry, it's very often thought of with Professor David Cooperrider of Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland. He's also a visiting professor at the Drucker School, which is another reason why I included this in the book. But this is this whole idea of uncovering the potential that's already within an organization and leveraging the practices that are already in place. And so it's kind of a bit similar when you think about it to knowledge management, which is also supposed to leverage what's already in the organization. And again, this is something so many organizations do so many things so well, but other people within that organization don't find out about it. And appreciative inquiry is one way for these things to surface. I also felt that if we switch back now to this idea of our own professional development, and I came up with this idea of becoming your own successor. And this was not a Drucker idea, but it was inspired by Drucker, and it's described more of the delineation of it within the book. But I decided that if you're going to become your own successor, and this is kind of a metaphorical idea in a way, it could mean a promotion within your organization, it could mean you stay within your same job, but you reinvent the way that you do it. It could mean moving off to something different, a different type of career perhaps, but it's the idea that you're more in the driver's seat than your organization. So you can stay there or you cannot stay there, it just sort of depends. But in order to really become your own successor, there has to be this level of professional and personal excellence. And so some of the things, and these are things that are certainly inspired from Drucker's teaching and especially from his life and work. I'll just go over them very quickly, that you diversify your efforts and your outputs. You develop a powerful personal brand. I don't think Drucker himself maybe would like the terminology of a personal brand, but I think it's true. His own personal brand stood for integrity, it stood for knowledge, it stood for quality, and of course I think those are great things for any personal brand or organizational brand. And that he also told me that you needed a global outlook and a global worldview, that these were just really, really important things, and not everybody thought that way, but in the way the world was going, it was important that we did that. Remaining relevant is also super important. Drucker remained relevant right till the end of his life, into his 90s. So again, what are the things that you need to do to remain relevant to people of all ages? And this really comes into play now when we have multiple generations mixing within the workplace. So how do you remain relevant to other people? Again, this idea of creating a consistent, impressive body of work, this harkens back to what I said earlier in the webinar about Drucker and these many, many articles and many, many books, amongst other things. But that it's cumulative, so it's consistent and it's impressive, and you can point to it, this is my body of work. And that work, you do things that benefits other people. I think that really this is what Drucker's work was predicated on. It was predicated on helping people and organizations improve and have better lives and better futures. So, okay, we've accepted that we need this excellence in order to become our own successor. What are some ways that we can do that? Now, these are things that I really can't talk about for a really long period of time because we're somewhat limited in time. But just a few, and then again they're described more in the book. And these are things that are you've seen in other books and articles, but I feel it's important to pull them all together. One is the idea of mindfulness. You see a graphic of somebody meditating, but it does not have to be. It certainly can be mindfulness meditation, but it doesn't have to be. And I describe in the book, I talk about the work of a friend of mine, a professor at the Drucker School named Jeremy Hunter, and the great work he's done with mindfulness and teaching mindfulness and other related topics to MBA students at the Drucker School. So mindfulness is one thing. Again, all these things as tools is for their inner strength tools, so that you can have this great future-focused mindset. Second is the relaxation response. This was started in the 1970s by a man who at the time was a professor at Harvard named Dr. Herbert Benson. Had a multi-million selling book, still sells a lot of copies of that same title, The Relaxation Response. But it's not the idea of relaxing. It's the idea of calming and getting a proper heartbeat and blood flow and things like that. And there's lots of material available about that on the web, as there is with mindfulness. And the third part of this is the idea of self-efficacy. This is generally thought of in terms of a wonderful professor named Albert Bandura at Stanford University, who I think of as somewhat of a Drucker-like figure. And this is sort of in one way of thinking, it would be confidence, but confidence aimed at a particular thing that you're doing, that you feel that you have the wherewithal, the knowledge, or you could find that to do that particular activity. So it really kind of depends on the activity. You kind of really have to have a reasonable shot of accomplishing it. It's not something, let's say, if you have not had any training as being an astronaut, you couldn't become an astronaut tomorrow. You couldn't go into space tomorrow. But so it has to be something that's reasonable. But it's just a wonderful construct, and I talk about it quite a bit in the book. Another construct, another Harvard professor, Howard Gardner, 5 months for the future. You've probably seen Howard Gardner's idea of the multiple intelligences. This is something he started writing about more than 30 years ago. It's still something that's talked about quite a bit, but in our case, because he wrote this entire book about the ways we need to think for the future, I described them just briefly in the book, and I'll just go over them briefly here. There's 5 minds: the disciplined mind, the synthesizing mind, the creating mind, the respectful mind, and the ethical mind. Now again, who wouldn't want to have these things? But they're difficult, and they're also difficult to put together. Now, also in this idea of succession, I decided that some people were really super successors, and I describe more in the book, but just a handful right now. Doug Conant, who was CEO of Campbell Soup, retired, but now very successful author. He's a successful consultant. Just started a new institute at the Kellogg School at Northwestern, where he graduated from. Edward Tufte, who for 32 years was a professor at Yale and Princeton, but very successful now, going out there writing these books about graphical information. He self-published books before it was cool. If you've seen these books, you know that they're just absolutely beautiful books, and he's just a fantastic presenter, and he has very heavy web presence, as does Doug Conant. Richard Branson transitioned from the mail order record business to now, Virgin Airways, Virgin Galactic, and all sorts of other things. He's an active author. He's also active on Twitter. Again, he's really succeeded himself. And Frances Hesselbein, who's the CEO of the Frances Hesselbein Leadership Institute, worked with Drucker a lot when she was the CEO of the Girl Scouts, and he was doing pro bono. And she formed her organization after she retired, which I think is really important to point out, that she kind of sailed past retirement. So she did retire from the Girl Scouts, but then formed this organization, which is now 23 years old. And we really don't have too much time here now. Just spending just a couple minutes on these things just beyond the workplace. I have a final chapter of the book where I talk about where the roles of religion and spirituality, also the roles of adult development, of kind of the ways that you think. But I will point out these existential questions that Drucker posed in one of his articles in the 60s. So think about this. Who am I? What do I want to be? What do I want to put into life? And what do I want to get out of it? These are simple on the face of it, but again, as with much of Drucker, it really requires some thought. It's not always easy to put into action. For the spirituality part of this, I described in the book another somewhat Drucker-like figure named Alexander W. Aston at UCLA and his colleagues, and they studied college students in spirituality. And I felt that the way they delineated things was really important in terms of listing spiritual qualities and religious qualities. So very quickly there you see 5 spiritual qualities, which they describe more in their book. I describe in briefly in my book: equanimity, spiritual quest, the ethic of caring, charitable involvement, and ecumenical worldview. The religious qualities: religious commitment, religious engagement, religious and social conservatism, religious skepticism, and religious struggle. And then going back, we've talked to several people here from Harvard. Harvard theorist Robert Kegan, some of you may have come across his work, the mental complexity model for thinking about the future. And the 3 different minds, we talked about Howard Gardner and the 5 minds for the future. So here's a few minds to think about that you can kind of match with Howard Gardner's. And then one is the socialized mind, the self-authoring mind, and then the top and the most I guess you would call it the top level and the most difficult, which is the self-transforming mind. And again, these are certainly in Keegan's books, but I also explain them briefly in my book as well. So some of the activities that you can do, these are some listed in the book. There's certainly more that, again, beyond your current workplace, because if your work is just all-consuming and everything is built around the current workplace, that might not be such a great idea. And that's one of the things that Drucker talked about in my first book, Living in More Than One World. And then finally, meaningful retirements, encore careers. There's a group, encore.org, that you saw one of their slides for awards, creating futures for others through scholarships that you could either start or that you could contribute to. So you can learn more about this. I have the URL up for the page on my website where I describe my book more, Create Your Future the Peter Drucker Way. And thanks for participating. You can learn a lot more at my website. I've also put the URLs for the Drucker Institute in California and also the Drucker School. So I guess we've got about 22 or 23 minutes, so I'm happy to have discussion. And again, thanks for giving me the opportunity to do this.
Great, Bruce. Thank you very much. Eric here. I have an appreciation for Drucker now after your very concise but really expansive remarks
Well, thank you.
I never had before.
That's great. Thank you.
I never really thought of him as a philosopher as much as I do now.
That's great. That's a good way of putting it. Yeah, and I think that the idea of Drucker as philosopher is something that somebody, whether it's me or you or somebody else, needs to pursue more in the future, because I think you're correct. I think he could certainly be considered a philosopher.
Well, and that's where sort of the best minds and ideas originate, is in really, if I think about other sort of towering figures like him, I put him in the same category as an Einstein or they were almost philosophers first, and scientists. Science was the way in which Einstein expressed his outlook on the world and curiosity about the world and how it worked.
Right.
Any remarks about that parallel between Einstein and Drucker?
That's a really interesting point. And of course, they for a number of years they would have been, I guess, Einstein from, let's say, maybe the 1910s to believe he died in the late 50s. So there was really a parallel in terms of years when they were both working. And I don't know whether Drucker, I think he referenced Einstein at a certain point, but I think that would be a fruitful thing for someone to look into. It's also possible that if you go on the Drucker Institute site, there's a great link for their archives, Drucker archives, and maybe just do a keyword search on Einstein and see if he's mentioned at all in some of the letters that are up there and correspondence, not necessarily to Einstein himself. But another thing, Einstein was based in New Jersey at Princeton, and Drucker, I'm pretty sure during those years was actually living in Montclair, New Jersey. So who knows? They may have met at some point. So it might be fruitful territory for people to look into.
What nationality was Peter Drucker? He was
Austrian. He was born in Austria. He went to college in Germany. He worked in Germany, and then he worked in England, and then he came to the United States in 1937.
And wasn't he
28 years old.
Wasn't he like a patent examiner, or am I confusing him with Einstein there again?
Yeah, Einstein was the patent examiner, right? Drucker did work in the financial world for a while, but he just decided he didn't like it, and that wasn't a good use of his time. So he wanted to become a writer. He had done some reporting and editing when he was in Germany, and he fashioned this career for himself, this three-pronged career. Eventually, where he eventually added consulting. But he had the three-pronged career as the writer, consultant, and teacher. So, and I think that's just tremendously admirable that he did that. Was somewhat ahead of his time as well.
A lot of people associate Drucker with his work at General Motors and
right.
sort of where he kind of tested a lot of these ideas and theories and structural, concepts. Can you talk a little bit about the General Motors laboratory and his work there with, what was the guy's name? I'm blanking on the
Sloan.
Sloan, yeah.
Alfred Sloan, yeah. Drucker wrote a book called Concept of the Corporation, where in the 1940s, where he was given access. One of the executives of General Motors had read one of Drucker's early books. I think he had maybe 2 or 3 books before Concept of the Corporation. This man read one or more of Drucker's books, liked it, and offered to give Drucker complete access for something like a year or two, where Drucker would come to Detroit and would have access to General Motors and then write about it. And what came out of it was this book called Concept of the Corporation, which you can still get, and but it was somewhat critical, I think, of GM at the time. Maybe not totally, but somewhat. And I think that my understanding was some of the management of GM at that time just didn't really like it. Now later on, I think many years later, I believe he actually came back as a consultant. I'm pretty sure he did, but that was much later. So for a long time, he was not part of that. But he did write, and you're talking about philosophy, and the Concept of the Corporation went well beyond just General Motors, and it's a book that's still referenced today. But again, just getting in there and really learning about it. I mean, he was very in this privileged position where just learning how an organization ran on a day-to-day basis. One of the things when he told me in 2005 when I interviewed him was that the way that automobiles were made in what he knew originally in the 1940s, and now was, or 2005, was completely different. And the heavy computerization technology that was not really so much part of the puzzle back in 1944 or 45, whenever it was he went in there, there was just a huge difference. So he really, as far as I know, that was the most he was ever in, that he studied an organization. He did lots of consulting, but I think if he did go on site, it would probably be for limited amounts of time. But for GM, it was for quite a long period of time.
What would he have thought, I guess, if you were to imagine kind of what his opinion would be of the role of the corporation, at least in the United States today, We've got them being essentially declared people
Right.
with a lot of the Supreme Court free speech stuff, and just how really odd that concept is. What would he think about some of this today? We've got I think a lot of the electorate, a lot of the general populace of the country has very mixed feelings about the role of the corporation in our world. Some, I just saw that they named the top 10 most evil corporations, and I won't name them here for posterity's sake. You can Google it, but a lot of them are not. I'm sure they don't think of themselves as evil. They
Right.
think of
Right.
themselves as productive. They're producing value for their shareholders. What would he think of that? I guess today.
Well, it's hard to say because he could be a contrarian in the way that he sometimes you'd expect him to think say one thing and he would say another. But I think that he would certainly say that organizations need to think of the widest amount of stakeholders and not just shareholders. They do need to think of the community. They do need to think of the people who work for them. He was very famous for saying that people should be treated as assets and not costs, people who your employees. He was also for many years very down on the idea of executives getting just a tremendous amount, X times the difference between, let's say, the lowest employee and the CEO, that he felt that was really not good, that there shouldn't be that kind of disparity. And he was also very much in favor of social entrepreneurship. So I think that companies who are good at corporate social responsibility, companies who maybe, some companies who maybe are very good at increasing the benefits of society, where we very often think of social entrepreneurship as just strictly nonprofits, but it could happen also with for-profit as well. So I think that he would be very much in favor of that. So this whole idea of are you benefiting people? Are you contributing to the growth of the people who work for you? Are you, as let's say, if you're a manager, are you contributing to your own self-growth and your own self-development? But again, getting back to that thing, that quote I had up in the slide earlier of the company, even if you're successful now, you're a failure if you're not providing for tomorrow, if you're not at least trying to get to a better tomorrow, which means changes in what you do. So I think that people within corporations, especially those who have decision-making capabilities and responsibilities, really need to look at these Drucker quotes very seriously. What he said, the spirit of what he said, and then really think. Today is obviously very important. There's no doubt about that. But so is tomorrow. And really just look at these things in the widest possible sense and see how they would apply to you, because we really need for our corporations to be doing good work, yes, for their shareholders, but for lots of other people as well, and for benefiting people all over the globe. And again, this gets back to this idea of the global worldview that he said was so important.
What do you think he would think were his most important contributions, and were there any subject matter areas that he wished he had more time or made better progress on that he still hoped or wanted to write about?
Yeah, as far that's very tough to say as far as what he did say things like that he felt his impact on people was very important, that if he gave them insight by if they heard him speak or if they read things, that sort of became part of their being in some way, that was certainly very important. And I think this idea of achievement, and I know that he talked about this when I interviewed him for the first book, that he said that this was in a context of being money focused versus achievement focused, and he said if you're achievement focused, that you can, there's always something more to do, which was in some ways really good. That you could always build on that. You wouldn't necessarily get to the point where maybe in some other endeavors where there's an empty feeling because you've done something and now there's nothing else, or you've reached the highest office, let's say within political office or within a corporation, let's say, or another organization, so that you'd be achievement focused. And he also, in terms of his writing, this in this 5th chapter of the book, where I talk about some of the spiritual and religious aspects of things. And again, I'm not a theologian, I'm not a religious scholar, but Drucker's work in that area was pretty fascinating, and there's been some scholarly work by other people about that. But he's on record as saying that one of his absolute favorite things that he ever wrote was something in the 40s. It's been anthologized in at least a couple of books. I believe it's available online, called The Unfashionable Kierkegaard. And here we come back to philosophy. But it was both philosophy and religion and spirituality. And I quote from that several times in my book. So I think that he'd want to be known for well beyond business, and that he would want people also reading things like what he wrote for the thing called The Unfashionable Kierkegaard. I discovered, by the way, through the Drucker archives, that the original article, which was in, I believe, a scholarly publication, and then, as I said, was anthologized in a couple of books, when he taught at Bennington College in Vermont in the 40s, I think it was his first or second teaching job, I think his second teaching job, that started as a speech at Bennington, long before it came out as an article or long before it came into the book. So it shows you the evolution of his work. And again, I would recommend to the people on the webinar today that they look at the Drucker Archives material, which is searchable, and things that are not copyright. Many of those are on there. And I know you can find this speech he gave at Bennington about Kierkegaard. And so I think you really would want to be felt that known for not just business and not just business management and not just management, even though we think of him as the father of modern management, that he was just so much more than management, as important as management is.
Yep. You mentioned Craig Fleischer. Craig's actually on the webinar today, listening in.
Oh, fantastic.
We had a question for you. In fact, and by the way, I'd like to remind the audience that feel free to submit your questions. We're here for another 8 minutes or so at least, and we'll take all of Bruce's time that we can. Craig asks, I'd be curious to know how Bruce thinks Drucker would feel about today's heavy move toward big data, statistics, and data mining. Would he have been in favor of moving further and faster in this direction, or would he be more likely to remind us yet again of the inherently human elements of business and commerce?
Well, I think that he would certainly keep the human element in mind. That you certainly need human beings to make important judgments, to manage things. I think he'd be very interested in the whole idea of big data, and I know that he, for instance, he did some consulting in the 50s and maybe beyond that for IBM. So I think he'd be very interested in it. But I do think, and he talked about something that many of us are very familiar with, this continuum of data to information to knowledge. So I think it's the whole idea of that. Yes, we have the data, but it's what we do with that data and how that data can be converted into information and knowledge, and something that's really actionable. And then, within that, what is the role of human beings? And I think that that's a really central question now, and I think that he would struggle with it when we have software that can do so many things and that can be disruptive and be an intermediary. What is the role of human beings, and is it the super judgmental role is a super decision-making role. So I think that he would just say that data is the is just the first part of things. It's the raw material. It's something that we've always had. We have more of it now. We have more ways of collecting it, more ways of analyzing it. But I think my view of what he would say is that unless that can turn into something where you can make not just decisions, but good decisions, decisions that were important for our organizations and for society, for the economy, that was the most important thing. So our people working today in various fields who are working in this area of big data, what is going to be, we need to think about what the ultimate good is going to be, and are we in some stage now where even big data is sort of an intermediate thing, and there'll be something that will come along and replace, might be similar, but might replace the concept of big data. So I think we are getting, back, Eric, to what you said about this idea of Drucker as a philosopher, and looking at these concepts in, putting them under the microscope. And so again, it would be fascinating. It would be great if we had Peter Drucker around right now, and wouldn't it be great to have him blogging about big data and writing articles in Harvard Business Review and elsewhere about big data. So I think we can only do our conjectures, but it's important to think about it, and thanks for the question. And Craig, thanks again for your, as with Eric and Chris Hode of Digimind, for your great quotations in my book.
Great. Alan Michaels, I believe you have a question for Bruce. Why don't you go next?
Yes, thank you. That was terrific, Bruce. I really appreciated that.
Well, thanks, Alan.
At Industry Building Blocks, we've been doing a lot of work on a type of interest graph called Industry Graph, where you look at all these competitors and ecosystems, and a lot of times competitors form, all these business partner relationships, and they're not always direct competitors. If you looked at Peter Drucker, who would he kind of like bond with, and who would he kind of be against? If you looked at if you kind of plotted all the management gurus out of there, who would be close to?
Yeah, wow. If he, well, I know that he, I'm trying to think right now of people that he really, I'm sure he had, a number of friendships with people. I know, well, certainly one that he had a big friendship with, and who wrote about him a lot, very perceptively, is Warren Bennis, and one of the top, if not the top, leadership gurus. And I interviewed Warren when I did a feature story on Drucker when I wrote for USA Today in 2002, and he gave me some really perceptive things within that, and I've stayed in touch with him over the years and read his books, and I think they're just fantastic. So that would be certainly someone. Another person more on the management end of things, who I also interviewed for that article. Now, I don't know exactly how well he knew Drucker in a personal sense, but I believe he did, was Gary Hamel, who's written a number of great books, and I mentioned, in both my books, I mentioned the book he wrote with C.K. Prahalad called Competing for the Future. And if you look in that book, he talks about, the intellectual debt to Drucker. So, but I think, what you touch on also is a larger point, which is that Drucker really reached out to all different sorts of people, and they reached out to him, and he was interested in very interesting people. Those are the kind of people he, because of his intellectual curiosity, and he was just good at reaching out to people, and so that was an important thing that he did. So he did make it his business to know a number of people, and he would meet with them or talk with them on the phone or what have you. And so I think we can certainly learn from that. I also mentioned Francis Hesselbein, where when they Francis Hesselbein, Bob Buford, and Dick Schubert started what was then called the Peter F. Drucker Foundation for Nonprofit Management, now Francis Hesselbein Leadership Institute. And that was in 1990, and they brought Drucker along within that. So, Drucker wrote for them, he spoke for them, he was honorary chairman for quite some time. So this idea of alliances and friendships definitely very important, and I think definitely something that people need to look into, because it's, as you know, it's difficult to do everything by yourself.
Well, thank you very much, Bruce. I just have one kind of final remark. I don't know if it's a question or not, but I've only seen Drucker speak in public once, and I think that's just relative to my youth probably. But I was in San Diego at the Hotel del Coronado for a knowledge management conference that was hosted by a guy named Tom Kalopoulos.
Right. Yes.
Who I think is in Boston now, and I think he was interviewing Drucker on stage about Drucker's sort of knowledge worker quote. I think he coined the term knowledge worker, if
right. Yes,
I remember that right, and sort of how the future of work being a knowledge undertaking. Now we kind of look back on that as 15 years ago, and it's a little obvious, but
right.
at the time, it was a fairly controversial idea that the majority of the value that enterprises and employees, for that matter, would create would come through these intangible assets. And I remember during the 90s there being a lot of discussion amongst the CFO set as to exactly how they value those assets, intellectual assets, as they finally grew. And I believe it was 92 that the S&P 500 at the time past the greater than 50% of the market cap of the S&P 500 was made up of intangible assets. And so, I guess as that continues to accelerate, I mean, today we've got enterprises like Facebook and Twitter who apparently, virtually all of their assets are intangible. How's that look for the future? Now that we're sort of winding up here, where I'm driving at is, what do you think Drucker would think of that from a future standpoint? How do people position themselves going forward to exploit and explore that future most successfully for themselves? And that'll be our last question, by the way, folks, for today. We thank you very much, Bruce, for your tremendous remarks and insights about Peter Drucker. We look forward to reading the book. Thank you for my complimentary copy, by the way.
You're quite welcome.
But back to my question, I'll let you answer that, and then we'll kind of wrap up.
Okay. Well, yeah. This I think it's important, this concept of what's intangible. And you're right. I mean, he felt that knowledge workers were, he saw this ahead of time, that what was important was what we knew, what we can learn, not so much the tools that we were working with, because yes, they're important, but they're going to change as time goes on. So I think this idea of just keeping as broad a within mind of knowledge, of how that's going to change, of what you have that maybe, if not that other people don't have, but that you have it in somewhat of a different way, just because all of us are different in terms of our experience and our learning. So I think as far as positioning yourself for the future, that it is this idea, we'll accept that knowledge is intangible, except for what you can, the end result of it. And that maybe those are the things we make tangible in some way. So if it's a book, if it's a company, if it's a hospital, whatever it is, that we take those ideas and we make something tangible out of them. And I think with something like Facebook and Twitter, which are, as I see it, they're platforms for other people to do things in really interesting ways, then part of the future is going to be for those companies and companies that aspire in that way. Are there platforms that can be created that would be that would allow people to express their knowledge and their learning and their ingenuity, and however that's done? And I think that's a fruitful thing for people to think about in the future. And I think we all need to take our own individual capabilities and see where they fit in with that. So you've given me a lot to think about, and I really appreciate the opportunity to do this. I've certainly had a lot of fun, and thank you very much, and thank you to all the participants as well.
Well, thank you, Bruce. Once again, very insightful. I see Drucker with a new pair of eyes now, and look forward to
Fantastic.
finishing your book
Well,
as
thanks.
well. So I'm sure you'd be interested in anyone who have questions or comments, or just give you a call or interact with you.
Absolutely, yeah. My email address is up there, so please email me. I'm certainly happy to stay in touch with people.
Great, and of course you're available for weddings and bar mitzvahs, and
That's
obviously
true.
the odd business meeting if people need a speaker. It sounds like too.
I definitely am. Yes.
Wonderful. I encourage you, everybody, if you do have those needs, to contact Bruce. We will be having a January webinar. I don't know when or what the topic will be or even who the speaker will be, but I'll work that out here in the next few days. And watch the LinkedIn group that Alan administers to hear updates about that, as well as in my Twitter feed at least. Bruce, once again, thanks. Alan, always a pleasure to have you here and promoting these two. We'll wish everyone a very happy holidays and a very prosperous, healthy, and happy new year when we'll speak to you again.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. See you next time.
Okay, thank you.